Okay, I've just finished knitting this Connections Cowl and I'm ready to do the sewn bind off. So I've cut the yarn that I'm not going to use for the sewn bind off because in this cowl I used green as the dominant color. And I'm going to measure out a long length, long enough to do the whole bind off. And I am going to measure about 3 times the width of the cowl to do that because I need a nice long length and I don't want to have to interrupt my sewn bind off. So that's 1, 2, 3, and break it. And I'm ready to go. And I have it still on the needles that I use to knit with. And I'm going to use a blunt tapestry needle. And it's important in this case to go with a blunt needle because you do not want to split the yarn on the stitches on the needle. And it's very easy to pick up a little bit of that yarn if you're using a sharp needle. So I have a nice blunt needle and I'm ready to go. And what I'll want to do for this outline sewn bind off is put my yarn above my needles and all the work. And since this stitch in green was my second to last stitch on the needle, I'm going to go through the back of the first stitch and just kind of get in position to do the rest of the bind off. Especially when you start, your yarn will kind of wrap around your needle and do annoying things like that. That's just unwrap it and go. So I'm going to go into the front of the second stitch on my needle and then out the back of the first stitch and up through the little circle that my sewing yarn will make. And as you see, as I tighten that, it makes kind of the pattern of an outline stitch in embroidery. Then I'm going to slip the first stitch off the needle and also slip the sewing yarn off the needle and kind of tighten up that cast off stitch. And I'm going to do the same thing again, casting my yarn above the needles, taking my blunt needle through the front of the second stitch and out through the back of the first stitch and making sure that I'm coming up in this circle of yarn and tightening it up. And then slipping that first stitch off. Tightening it up. You don't have to pull it too tight, you just kind of give it a little tug and sort of neaten it up. So I've cast off 2 stitches. And this will be the third cast off stitch. Yarn up above, blunt needle through the front of the second stitch, out through the back of the first stitch on the needle, and then pulling it up. And before I tighten it up, slipping those off, and then just giving it a little tug to tighten that up. And then again, and then I'll show you a couple of things that can happen during this cast off that you'll want to correct for. Front of the second stitch, out the back of the first stitch, and up through the circle. Tightening up the yarn. And then as I tighten it now, this time, you can see I've kind of come across the needle. That happens. Don't let that confuse you. Just slip that off and slip off your first stitch, leaving just the second stitch on the needle. And you can see that that yarn kind of encircles that second stitch. And that's how you want it, not any of the yarn that you're sewing with actually still over the needle. And especially when the yarn is really long, that can happen. So again, the front of the second stitch, out the back of the first stitch, and up through the circle of yarn. Slip the first stitch off and then tighten it up. And then when your first stitch makes a little bump, just kind of massage it in and it'll lay down. And then you just continue. It is tedious, but you will get a nice stretchy bind off, which works really well for a cowl or any kind of project where you want that bind off to be really nice and stretchy and not only not too tight, but create, you know, kind of that tight line that even though it fits over your head, it's not comfortable. And it looks like this along the top. Front of the second needle, out the back of the first, whoops, and up in through the circle of yarn. Slip the first stitch off and tighten it up. And you just proceed like that. If you find yourself where you have not given yourself enough yarn to complete the bind off, you can, you know, join in another piece of yarn to finish, but that's, you know, a step that you can avoid if you just make sure that it's long enough when you start. And I've found that about 3 times the width is plenty long enough, and it gives you a short tail that you can do in once you're finished. And that's how you do it. And I call this the eyelet, the outline stitch bind off.